The laughter started the moment I asked for directions to the powder room. Not polite chuckles or gentle corrections, but that particular brand of cruel amusement that comes when privileged people think they've found someone beneath them. Their voices carried across the marble foyer of Willowbrook Country Club, each syllable of my question dissected and mocked with theatrical precision. "Excuse me, where is the restroom?" mimicked Catherine Hartwell, the club president's wife, her voice dripping with exaggerated accent. The small group around her erupted in giggles, their manicured hands covering their mouths in false modesty. I stood frozen near the entrance, my designer handbag suddenly feeling like armor that wasn't quite thick enough. The emerald dress I'd carefully chosen for this luncheon, the one that had cost more than most people's monthly salary, felt insignificant under their scrutiny. But I'd learned long ago to keep my expression neutral when faced with cruelty disguised as humor. "Did you hear that rolled R?" whispered Margaret Preston, loud enough for half the foyer to hear. "It's so exotic. Where do you think she's from?" "Somewhere that doesn't have proper English lessons, clearly," replied Jennifer Walsh, her blonde bob swishing as she shook her head in mock sympathy. "Bless her heart, she's trying so hard to fit in." I'd encountered this before, of course, in boardrooms where men in expensive suits would lean back in their chairs and ask me to repeat myself, claiming they couldn't understand my charming accent. At charity galas where women would speak to me slowly, using simple words as if my Harvard MBA and fluency in 4 languages somehow made me intellectually deficient. But today felt different. Today, the mockery had an edge of territorial aggression. My name is Sofia Mendoza, and I'd built my fortune from nothing. My parents had immigrated from Colombia when I was 7, carrying dreams bigger than their suitcases and determination stronger than steel. My father worked 3 jobs while attending night school for his engineering degree. My mother cleaned houses during the day and studied English with library books late into the night. They taught me that success wasn't just about accumulating wealth, but about maintaining dignity in the face of those who would diminish you. "I think it's lovely," said a gentle voice beside me. I turned to see an elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair pulled into an elegant chignon. "Accents are like fingerprints, unique and beautiful. I'm Eleanor Whitfield." Before I could respond, Catherine Hartwell's voice cut through our introduction. "Oh, Eleanor, you're too kind. We're just having a bit of fun. I'm sure our new member understands it's all in good spirit." The way she said "new member" made it sound like a disease. I'd paid the $30,000 initiation fee 6 months ago, along with annual dues that could fund a small business. My membership had been processed without issue, my financial credentials more than sufficient. But standing here now, I realized money alone wouldn't buy me acceptance in their carefully curated world. "Of course," I replied, my voice steady despite the heat rising in my cheeks. "Fun." The luncheon invitation had arrived on cream-colored cardstock with gold embossing. "Annual Spring Charity Luncheon," it proclaimed in elegant script, "supporting local education initiatives." I'd RSVP'd immediately, writing a check for $5,000 to the cause. Education had always been close to my heart, remembering how my mother had saved pennies to buy me books when the library selection in Spanish was limited. Now, walking through the dining room toward my assigned table, I wondered if my donation would be enough to earn me basic human decency. The room was stunning, all crystal chandeliers and fresh white roses, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the pristine golf course, the kind of setting I'd once only seen in magazines, back when my family lived in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. "Sophia, darling," a warm voice called out, and I turned to see Vivian Ashworth approaching. I'd met her at a gallery opening last month where we'd bonded over our shared appreciation for emerging artists. "I'm so glad you could make it. Come, you're at my table." Relief flooded through me as she linked her arm through mine, guiding me toward a round table set for 8 near the center of the room. The other women at the table offered polite smiles and introductions, their expressions carefully neutral. I could sense their curiosity, the way they cataloged my jewelry, my dress, my shoes, trying to place me in their social hierarchy. Sophia owns Meridian Holdings, Vivian explained as we took our seats. They've been acquiring properties all over the state. Very impressive portfolio. A few eyebrows raised at this information. Meridian Holdings was my investment company, the vehicle through which I'd been quietly purchasing real estate for the past decade. I preferred to keep a low profile, working through intermediaries and holding companies. It allowed me to evaluate properties and people without the bias that came with knowing my net worth. "How interesting," said Linda Covington, a thin woman with sharp cheekbones and sharper eyes. "What type of properties do you focus on?" "Diverse investments," I replied carefully. "Residential, commercial, hospitality, whatever presents good value and growth potential." What I didn't mention was the specific nature of my recent acquisitions. 3 country clubs, to be exact, all exclusive, all struggling financially in the post-pandemic economy, all quietly desperate for the kind of capital injection that came with new ownership. I'd been researching the market for months, identifying clubs with strong underlying assets but poor management, perfect targets for strategic investment. The conversation moved on to safer topics: children's achievements, vacation plans, upcoming social events. I listened more than I spoke, filing away information about the dynamics at play: who deferred to whom, which names carried weight, what subtle codes governed their interactions. The first course arrived, a delicate spring salad with edible flowers and microgreens. I'd eaten in Michelin-starred restaurants around the world, but I took small bites and chewed thoughtfully, remembering my mother's lessons about table manners. "Watch and learn, Mija," she used to say. "Adaptation is survival." "Sophia, that's such an exotic name," Linda commented, pronouncing it with deliberate emphasis on each syllable. "Is it family tradition?" "It means wisdom in Greek," I replied evenly. "My parents chose it because they wanted me to value knowledge above all else." "How quaint," she smiled, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. "And where did you say your family was from originally?" I could feel the table's attention focusing on me, waiting for my answer. This was the moment where I could deflect, give a vague response, try to blend in. Instead, I chose honesty. "Colombia. My parents immigrated when I was young." "Oh," Linda smiled, faltered slightly. "Well, that explains the accent. It's quite pronounced." "I've been told it gives my presentations character," I said mildly. "Clients seem to find it memorable." What I didn't add was that some of those clients included heads of state, Fortune 500 CEOs, and investment partners who controlled billions in assets. My accent had never been a barrier to closing deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But in this dining room, surrounded by women whose greatest achievement was marrying well, it seemed to mark me as somehow lesser. The main course arrived, and conversation shifted to the upcoming golf tournament. I listened as they discussed handicaps and favorite courses, their voices carrying the casual confidence of people who'd never had to prove their belonging anywhere. Golf had been a later addition to my skill set, learned during business school when I realized how many deals were negotiated on fairways rather than in conference rooms. "Do you play golf, Sophia?" asked Margaret Preston, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer. "Occasionally," I replied, "though I prefer tennis." "Oh, we have wonderful tennis facilities here," Vivian interjected. "You should book a lesson with our pro. He's fantastic." "Perhaps," I said, not mentioning that I'd been ranked nationally in junior tennis before focusing on academics. Some things didn't need to be shared with people who were looking for ways to diminish you. As the dessert course was served, the program began. Catherine Hartwell took the stage, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system as she welcomed the guests and outlined the charity's mission. She spoke eloquently about the importance of educational opportunities, about giving children the tools they needed to succeed. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was advocating for inclusive education while excluding people based on their accents and origins. Before we conclude today's program, Catherine announced, I'd like to invite our newest member to say a few words. Sophia Mendoza has been kind enough to make a generous donation to our cause. Surprise flickered through me. This wasn't planned, wasn't mentioned in any of the materials I'd received, but I recognized the maneuver for what it was. Put the outsider on the spot, see how she handles herself, provide entertainment for the crowd. I'd seen similar tactics in hostile business environments. I stood slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. The room fell silent, all eyes turned toward me. I could feel their anticipation, their curiosity about whether I'd stumble over my words or retreat in embarrassment. Instead, I smiled and made my way to the microphone with the same confidence I'd carried into countless boardroom presentations. The stage lights were bright, but I could see their faces clearly. Some looked genuinely interested, others were expressions of barely concealed amusement. Catherine handed me the microphone with a smile that didn't quite mask her calculation. "Thank you for the warm welcome," I began, my voice steady and clear. "I want to share why education is so important to me." I paused, looking out over the assembled crowd. These women who'd mocked my accent, who'd made assumptions about my background, who'd treated me as entertainment rather than an equal, they had no idea what was coming. When my parents brought me to this country, we had very little. My father worked construction during the day and studied engineering at night. My mother cleaned offices and took English classes whenever she could. They sacrificed everything so I could have opportunities they never had. A few faces in the audience softened slightly. Perhaps they were remembering their own immigrant grandparents, the struggles that had built the foundations for their current comfort. Education became my passport to a different life. But more than that, it taught me to see value where others might not, to look beyond surface appearances and find the potential underneath. I could see Catherine shifting slightly beside the podium, perhaps sensing that this wasn't going in the direction she'd anticipated. That perspective has served me well in business. It's helped me identify undervalued assets, companies with strong fundamentals but poor public perception. Sometimes the best investments are the ones that others overlook or dismiss. My eyes found Linda Covington's table, where she sat with her mouth slightly open, as if beginning to understand that something unexpected was happening. Which brings me to why I'm particularly grateful to be here today. This morning, I finalized the acquisition of 3 properties that I've been pursuing for months. Properties with tremendous potential that were, perhaps, undervalued by their previous owners. The room had gone completely silent now. Even the servers had stopped moving, sensing the shift in energy. I'm pleased to announce that as of today, I am the majority owner of Willowbrook Country Club. Gasps rippled through the audience. Catherine's face went white, her hands gripping the edge of the podium. I could see Margaret Preston's mouth fall open in shock, Linda Covington's water glass trembling in her hand, along with Oakmont Hills Country Club and Riverside Golf and Tennis Club. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the soft whir of the air conditioning, the distant sound of lawn mowers on the golf course, my own heartbeat steady and strong. I wanted to address this community directly because I believe in transparency. Going forward, these clubs will maintain their commitment to excellence while embracing a more inclusive environment. Anyone who feels the need to mock another member's background, accent, or heritage will find their membership terminated immediately. Catherine's face had progressed from white to a splotchy red. She looked like she wanted to speak but couldn't find words. Around the room, women were turning to each other with expressions of shock, disbelief, and, in some cases, fear. My accent isn't a punchline, I continued, my voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. It's a reminder of where I came from and how far I've traveled. It represents the determination of parents who sacrificed everything for their daughter's future. And now, it's the voice of your new ownership. I paused, letting the words sink in. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so dramatically that I could almost feel it in the air. I want to be clear that nothing will change for members who treat others with respect and dignity. These clubs will continue to offer world-class amenities and services, but they will no longer be places where cruelty is disguised as humor, where exclusion is masked as tradition. Eleanor Whitfield, the elderly woman who'd been kind to me in the foyer, began to clap. Slowly, others joined her, though the applause was scattered and uncertain. Many faces still showed shock. Others calculated as they processed what this meant for their social standing. My accent isn't a punchline, I continued, my voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. It's a reminder of where I came from and how far I've traveled. It represents the determination of parents who sacrificed everything for their daughter's future. And now, it's the voice of your new ownership. I paused, letting the words sink in. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so dramatically that I could almost feel it in the air. I want to be clear that nothing will change for members who treat others with respect and dignity. These clubs will continue to offer world-class amenities and services, but they will no longer be places where cruelty is disguised as humor, where exclusion is masked as tradition. Eleanor Whitfield, the elderly woman who'd been kind to me in the foyer, began to clap. Slowly, others joined her, though the applause was scattered and uncertain. Many faces still showed shock. Others calculated as they processed what this meant for their social standing. The donation I've made today represents just the beginning of my commitment to educational initiatives in this community. But true education doesn't just happen in classrooms. It happens when they learn to see the humanity in others, regardless of how they speak or where they come from. I set the microphone back on the podium and returned to my table, leaving Catherine to somehow salvage the program. The walk back felt endless, every eye in the room tracking my movement. But I kept my chin high, my steps measured, remembering every lesson my parents had taught me about dignity under pressure. When I reached my seat, Vivian squeezed my hand under the table. "Well," she whispered, "that was certainly memorable." The rest of the program passed in a blur. Catherine somehow managed to deliver closing remarks, though her voice shook and she avoided looking in my direction. Women began filtering out, their conversations hushed and urgent. I could imagine the phone calls that would be made, the emergency meetings that would be scheduled, the frantic Googling of my company's portfolio. As the room emptied, Linda Covington approached my table. Her earlier smugness had been replaced by something that looked remarkably like panic. "Sophia," she began, her voice uncertain, "I hope you understand that earlier it was harmless fun. We didn't mean anything by it." I looked at her steadily, remembering every snide comment, every exaggerated pronunciation of my name, every look that suggested I didn't belong. "Harmless fun?" I repeated slowly. "Like the fun you had mimicking my accent in the foyer? Or the fun Margaret had wondering where I could get proper English lessons?" Linda's face flushed. It wasn't like that." "It was exactly like that," I said quietly. "But here's what you need to understand, Linda. I didn't acquire these clubs for revenge. I acquired them because they were good investments. The fact that they were owned by people who created hostile environments for anyone different from themselves was just an added benefit." She stood there uncertainly, clearly wanting to say something that might salvage the situation, but not knowing what words might accomplish that. "Your membership is safe," I continued, "as long as you remember that respect isn't optional, it's a requirement." She nodded quickly and retreated, leaving me with Vivian and Eleanor, who had lingered behind. "My dear," Eleanor said, her eyes twinkling with something that might have been admiration, "that was the most excitement this club has seen in 20 years. Vivian laughed. "I had no idea you were planning something like this." "Neither did I, until about an hour ago," I admitted. "The acquisition was business. The announcement was personal." Over the next hour, as the dining room gradually emptied, I found myself in conversations I'd never expected. Several women approached to apologize for their earlier behavior, their discomfort palpable, but their words seemingly genuine. Others simply avoided eye contact as they gathered their purses and headed for the exits. Margaret Preston appeared at my elbow as I was preparing to leave. "I owe you an apology," she said stiffly. "My comments were inappropriate." I studied her face, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus damage control. Thank you for saying that, Margaret. I appreciate it. That is, what happens now? Now we move forward, I said simply. The clubs continue operating, members continue enjoying the facilities, and everyone learns to treat each other with basic human decency. It's not complicated. But even as I said it, I knew it would be complicated. Social hierarchies don't crumble overnight, and people who've never had their prejudices challenged don't transform immediately. There would be resistance, resentment, and probably some departures, but that was a price I was willing to pay for change. As I walked through the parking lot toward my car, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 23 years since my family had arrived in this country with 2 suitcases and infinite hope. 15 years since I graduated from Harvard Business School and started my first company. 10 years since I'd became a millionaire. 5 years since I'd crossed into the 9-figure territory that put me among the truly wealthy. But today felt like the first time I'd used that wealth for something that mattered beyond profit margins and portfolio growth. Today, I'd used it to ensure that other daughters of immigrants wouldn't have to endure what I'd experienced. Children who spoke with their parents' accents wouldn't be made to feel ashamed of their heritage. My phone buzzed with text messages as I drove home. Word was already spreading through the social networks that connected these communities. By tomorrow, everyone in the city's elite circles would know that the quiet woman with the accent they'd dismissed had just acquired some of their most treasured institutions. I spent the evening in my home office, reviewing the acquisition documents one more time. The financial projections were solid. All 3 clubs had strong membership bases, excellent facilities, and prime real estate. With proper management and some strategic improvements, they would be profitable within 2 years and valuable long-term assets. But beyond the numbers, I felt something I hadn't expected, a sense of completion. For years, I'd been building wealth and influence while carefully navigating social spaces that merely tolerated my presence. Today, I'd stopped navigating and started leading. The next morning brought a stack of phone calls from reporters, investment analysts, and curious acquaintances. News of the acquisitions had made it into the business section of the local paper, along with speculation about my future plans. I declined most interview requests, preferring to let my actions speak for themselves. What I did accept was a call from the mayor's office. Apparently, my ownership of 3 major recreational facilities in the area made me a significant stakeholder in the community's economic development. Would I be interested in joining the tourism board, the economic development committee, a planning session for next year's cultural festival? I agreed to the cultural festival planning session. It seemed appropriate. 2 weeks later, I stood at the entrance to Willowbrook Country Club, watching the morning golf groups tee off under a perfect blue sky. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of meetings with club managers, staff, and the boards of directors for all 3 properties. Most of the conversations had been cordial, professional, focused on operational details and improvement plans. But there had been other conversations too. Angry phone calls from members who resented the ownership change, threats of mass resignations that mostly failed to materialize when people realized they'd lose their deposits and have nowhere else to go with equivalent facilities. A few actual departures from individuals who decided they'd rather start fresh somewhere else than adapt to new expectations. "Good morning, Miss Mendoza." The greeting came from James, the head groundskeeper at Willowbrook. He'd been with the club for 15 years and had initially been worried about his job security under new ownership. After our first meeting, where I'd praised his work and asked for his recommendations on course improvements, he'd become one of my strongest supporters. "Good morning, James. The course looks beautiful today." "Thank you, ma'am. We've been working on those drainage issues you mentioned. Should see real improvement by next month." I'd learned that James had an associate's degree in turf management and innovative ideas that had been ignored by previous ownership. One of my first acts had been to approve his budget requests for equipment upgrades and staff training. Respect, I'd discovered, was a 2-way street that yielded dividends when properly maintained. Inside the clubhouse, I found Catherine Hartwell waiting in my temporary office. She'd requested this meeting through the club manager, claiming she had important matters to discuss. I'd agreed, curious about what the former president's wife might want to say. "Thank you for seeing me," she began, her usual confidence replaced by nervous energy. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since the luncheon." I waited, letting her find her words. "I owe you more than an apology," she continued. "I owe you an explanation. What happened that day, the way we treated you, it wasn't just thoughtless, it was cruel, and it came from a place of insecurity that I'm not proud of. This was unexpected. I'd anticipated damage control, perhaps an attempt at manipulation, but her words seemed genuinely painful for her to say. You see," she went on, "my grandmother immigrated from Ireland in the 1920s. She faced terrible discrimination, people mocking her brogue, treating her like she was stupid because of how she spoke. She changed her name from Chauvin to Susan, practiced speaking with an American accent until she could pass for native-born." I leaned back in my chair, studying her face. I grew up hearing stories about that struggle, about how hard she worked to fit in. But somewhere along the way, instead of learning empathy, I learned to distance myself from that history, to make sure I was never on the receiving end of that treatment. "By putting others there instead," I said quietly. She nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. "By becoming the person who excluded others before they could exclude me. It's cowardly and cruel, and I'm ashamed of it." We sat in silence for a moment. Outside, I could hear the distant sound of golf carts and lawnmowers, the normal rhythms of a day at the club. "What do you want from me, Catherine?" "Nothing," she said quickly. "I don't expect forgiveness or special treatment. I just wanted you to know that your words at the luncheon hit home. They made me think about the person I've become versus the person I thought I was. And I'm working on changing that. I've signed up to volunteer with the ESL program at the community center. I figure it's time I helped people who are where my grandmother once was, instead of pretending that history doesn't exist." I found myself genuinely moved by her honesty. Change was possible, but only when people were willing to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. "That's good, Catherine. It's a start." She nodded and stood to leave, then paused at the door. "For what it's worth, you've given this place something it needed: accountability. Some members are angry about it, but others are relieved. They were tired of the subtle cruelty too, but didn't know how to address it." After she left, I remained in the office, processing our conversation. The past few weeks had taught me that my acquisition had done more than change ownership structures. It had forced an entire community to examine its values and behavior. Some, like Catherine, were embracing the opportunity for growth. Others were digging in their heels, resistant to any change that challenged their comfortable prejudices. My assistant knocked on the door, interrupting my thoughts. "Miss Mendoza, your 2 o'clock appointment is here." I checked my calendar. Marcus Rivera, the new head chef I'd hired for Oakmont Hills. He'd come highly recommended from a James Beard award-winning restaurant in Miami, and I was excited to see his plans for elevating the club's dining program. "Send him in." Marcus entered with the confidence of someone who knew his worth. Mid-30s, with the calloused hands of someone who'd worked his way up through kitchen hierarchies, he carried himself with dignity despite the skeptical reception he'd likely received from some members. "Miss Mendoza, thank you for this opportunity. I've reviewed the facilities at all 3 clubs, and I have some exciting ideas." We spent an hour discussing his vision for seasonal menus that would incorporate diverse culinary traditions while maintaining the refined atmosphere the members expected. His passion was infectious, his knowledge comprehensive. I could already imagine the positive changes he'd bring. "There's one thing I should mention," he said as our meeting concluded. "I've heard some comments about hiring practices, about maintaining certain standards. Nothing direct, but the implications were clear." I felt the familiar spark of anger, quickly controlled. "What kind of comments?" "Questions about whether I really understand the club's clientele, suggestions that the members might prefer more traditional cuisine, concerns about whether I can relate to the membership." "And your response?" He smiled grimly. "I told them my food speaks for itself, and that if they prefer their prejudice seasoned with bland mediocrity, they're welcome to eat elsewhere." I laughed despite myself. "I think you'll fit in perfectly, Marcus." That evening, I attended a wine tasting event at Riverside Golf and Tennis Club. It was my first social appearance as the openly acknowledged owner, and I wasn't sure what kind of reception to expect. The answer turned out to be complicated. A cluster of members approached me throughout the evening, some to express support for the changes I was implementing, others to voice concerns about the club's direction. A few simply ignored me entirely, continuing conversations as if I weren't present. The most interesting interactions came from people who seemed torn between their personal prejudices and their respect for financial success. "I have to admit," said Robert Dalton, a retired bank president, "when I first heard about the ownership change, I had reservations. But your business background is impressive. Meridian Holdings has quite a reputation." Thank you, Robert. I believe the clubs will benefit from professional management focused on long-term value rather than short-term social dynamics. Yes, well, he paused, clearly wrestling with something. I suppose what I'm trying to say is that you've exceeded expectations. The backhanded nature of the compliment wasn't lost on me, but I recognized it as progress. For someone who'd probably never had a serious conversation with a Latina business owner, acknowledging my competence represented a significant shift in thinking. More encouraging were the conversations with staff members. Over the past weeks, I'd made it a point to meet with employees at all levels, from groundskeepers to servers to administrative assistants. Many shared stories of subtle discrimination they'd faced from members, instances where their professionalism had been questioned because of their accents, their names, or their appearance. "It feels different now," Maria Gonzalez, a server at Willowbrook, had told me, "like I don't have to make myself smaller to do my job." That sentiment was repeated by others. The knowledge that ownership would no longer tolerate discrimination had created a more respectful environment for everyone, not just the members. 3 months after the acquisition, I received an unexpected invitation. The State Business Association wanted to present me with their Entrepreneur of the Year award. The ceremony would be held at the convention center with an audience of several hundred business leaders from across the region. I almost declined. Public recognition had never been my goal, and I preferred the influence that came with operating behind the scenes. But my publicist convinced me that the platform could be valuable for promoting the causes I cared about. The evening of the award ceremony, I stood backstage listening to my introduction. The presenter, a prominent local businessman, recited my achievements with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for hometown sports heroes. Meridian Holdings portfolio, my MBA from Harvard, the recent country club acquisitions that had generated significant media attention. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sofia Mendoza. I walked onto the stage to enthusiastic applause, accepting the Crystal Award and moving to the podium. The audience stretched out before me, a sea of mostly unfamiliar faces representing the region's business elite. I spotted a few members from my clubs in the crowd, their expressions ranging from pride to discomfort. "Thank you for this honor," I began. "When my parents brought me to this country 23 years ago, they carried dreams that seemed impossible. My father wanted to use his engineering degree to build bridges. My mother wanted to teach children. I wanted to prove that a little girl with an accent could achieve anything she set her mind to." The applause that followed felt genuine, warm. I could see nods of recognition from other immigrants in the audience, people who understood the particular challenges of building success while navigating cultural barriers. Tonight, I want to talk about a different kind of bridge building, the kind that happens when we choose inclusion over exclusion, when we value diversity as strength rather than viewing it as threat. I recounted my experience at the country club luncheon, the mockery I'd faced, and the decision to use my position to create change. The audience listened intently, some shifting uncomfortably as they recognized their own institutions and behaviors in my story. "Business success isn't just about financial returns," I continued. "It's about creating value for all stakeholders, including communities that have been historically excluded from opportunity. When we diversify our leadership, our thinking, and our perspectives, we make better decisions and achieve better outcomes." The speech concluded with a standing ovation that lasted nearly 2 minutes. Afterward, I was surrounded by people wanting to congratulate me, share their own stories, or discuss potential business opportunities. The evening stretched long as I found myself in conversations about immigrant entrepreneurship, the importance of mentorship, and the responsibility that comes with success. What I did accept was a call from the mayor's office. Apparently, my ownership of 3 major recreational facilities in the area made me a significant stakeholder in the community's economic development. Would I be interested in joining the tourism board, the economic development committee, a planning session for next year's cultural festival? I agreed to the cultural festival planning session. It seemed appropriate. 2 weeks later, I stood at the entrance to Willowbrook Country Club, watching the morning golf groups tee off under a perfect blue sky. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of meetings with club managers, staff, and the boards of directors for all 3 properties. Most of the conversations had been cordial, professional, focused on operational details and improvement plans. But there had been other conversations too. Angry phone calls from members who resented the ownership change, threats of mass resignations that mostly failed to materialize when people realized they'd lose their deposits and have nowhere else to go with equivalent facilities. A few actual departures from individuals who decided they'd rather start fresh somewhere else than adapt to new expectations. "Good morning, Miss Mendoza." The greeting came from James, the head groundskeeper at Willowbrook. He'd been with the club for 15 years and had initially been worried about his job security under new ownership. After our first meeting, where I'd praised his work and asked for his recommendations on course improvements, he'd become one of my strongest supporters. "Good morning, James. The course looks beautiful today." "Thank you, ma'am. We've been working on those drainage issues you mentioned. Should see real improvement by next month." I'd learned that James had an associate's degree in turf management and innovative ideas that had been ignored by previous ownership. One of my first acts had been to approve his budget requests for equipment upgrades and staff training. Respect, I'd discovered, was a two-way street that yielded dividends when properly maintained. Inside the clubhouse, I found Catherine Hartwell waiting in my temporary office. She'd requested this meeting through the club manager, claiming she had important matters to discuss. I'd agreed, curious about what the former president's wife might want to say. "Thank you for seeing me," she began, her usual confidence replaced by nervous energy. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since the luncheon." I waited, letting her find her words. "I owe you more than an apology," she continued. "I owe you an explanation. What happened that day, the way we treated you, it wasn't just thoughtless, it was cruel, and it came from a place of insecurity that I'm not proud of." This was unexpected. I'd anticipated damage control, perhaps an attempt at manipulation, but her words seemed genuinely painful for her to say. "You see," she went on, "my grandmother immigrated from Ireland in the 1920s. She faced terrible discrimination, people mocking her brogue, treating her like she was stupid because of how she spoke. She changed her name from Chauvin to Susan, practiced speaking with an American accent until she could pass for native-born." I leaned back in my chair, studying her face. I grew up hearing stories about that struggle, about how hard she worked to fit in. But somewhere along the way, instead of learning empathy, I learned to distance myself from that history, to make sure I was never on the receiving end of that treatment. "By putting others there instead," I said quietly. She nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. "By becoming the person who excluded others before they could exclude me. It's cowardly and cruel, and I'm ashamed of it." We sat in silence for a moment. Outside, I could hear the distant sound of golf carts and lawnmowers, the normal rhythms of a day at the club. "Business administration with a focus on social entrepreneurship. I want to create companies that solve problems in communities like mine." "That's exactly what the world needs," I told her. "Don't let anyone convince you that your background is a disadvantage. It's your greatest asset because it gives you perspectives that others lack." As Carmen rejoined her friends, I reflected on how far we'd all come. The clubs were thriving financially, with membership actually increasing as word spread about their more welcoming atmosphere. Several competitors had begun implementing similar inclusion initiatives, creating a positive ripple effect throughout the industry. But perhaps more significantly, the conversations had changed. Where once there had been casual cruelty disguised as humor, there were now genuine efforts to understand and connect across differences. It wasn't perfect. Prejudice doesn't disappear overnight, but it was progress. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, the chef who'd joined us 6 months earlier. Boss, just got off the phone with Food and Wine magazine. They want to feature our fusion menu concept in next month's issue. This thing is really taking off. I smiled, remembering his nervousness about whether the members would accept his innovative approach to club dining. His confidence in his abilities had been justified, and his success was opening doors for other talented professionals who might previously have been overlooked. As the evening wound down, I found myself in the spot where it had all begun, the marble foyer where Catherine Hartwell and her friends had mocked my accent 9 months earlier. The space looked the same, with its gleaming floors and crystal chandelier, but the energy was completely different. Instead of cruel laughter echoing off the walls, I heard genuine conversations, people from different backgrounds finding common ground over shared interests and aspirations. Catherine herself approached as I stood there, her husband trailing behind with an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. She'd kept her word about volunteering with the ESL program, and I'd heard through community channels that her involvement had been meaningful rather than performative. "Sophia, thank you for tonight," she said, her voice carrying none of the artificial sweetness I remembered from our first encounter. "The scholarship program is remarkable. Those young people are incredible." "They are," I agreed. "They remind me that talent and determination exist everywhere, but opportunity doesn't always follow." Her husband, Richard, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I have to admit, I had my doubts about the direction you were taking the clubs, but the financial performance speaks for itself. Revenue is up 18% across all 3 properties." I studied his face, recognizing the internal struggle between his personal biases and his respect for financial success. Like many in his generation, he'd been raised to believe that business excellence and cultural diversity were somehow incompatible. The numbers were forcing him to reconsider those assumptions. "Good business is about maximizing all forms of value," I replied, "financial, social, cultural. When you create environments where everyone can thrive, everyone benefits." A server appeared at my elbow with a silver tray. "Miss Mendoza, there's a gentleman at the bar who asked me to give you this." The note was written on expensive stationery, the handwriting careful and formal. "Miss Mendoza, I wonder if I might have a word with you before the evening ends. I represent Pinnacle Country Club Management, and we have a proposition that might interest you. William Harrison III." I knew the name. Harrison came from one of the city's oldest families, the kind of generational wealth that traced its roots back to railroad barons and steel magnates. Pinnacle managed a dozen exclusive clubs across 3 states, all bastions of old money tradition and carefully guarded exclusivity. I found him at the far end of the bar, nursing a scotch that probably cost more than most people's daily wages. He was exactly what central casting would order for wealthy WASP patriarch. Silver hair, navy blazer with subtle gold buttons, the kind of understated confidence that came from never having to prove your worth to anyone. "Mr. Harrison," I said, extending my hand, "your note mentioned a proposition." He stood, his handshake firm but brief. "Thank you for your time. I'll get straight to the point. What you've accomplished here has caught the attention of my board of directors." I waited, curious about where this was heading. "Pinnacle has been facing some challenges recently. Declining membership, increased scrutiny from younger demographics who find our traditional approach less appealing. We've been looking for ways to modernize without compromising our standards." "And you think I might have insights to offer?" "I think you've proven that inclusion and excellence aren't mutually exclusive. Your clubs have maintained their prestige while expanding their appeal. That's a difficult balance to achieve." He paused, taking a sip of his scotch before continuing. "We'd like to offer you a consulting contract. Help us navigate the transition to a more contemporary approach. The compensation would be substantial and the influence significant. You'd be helping shape the future of elite hospitality across multiple markets." It was an intriguing offer, the kind of opportunity that could expand my impact far beyond these 3 clubs. But I'd learned to be cautious about partnerships with people who viewed diversity as a business strategy rather than a moral imperative. "What exactly would you want me to change?" "Our membership requirements, for starters. They're based on legacy connections and social references that essentially exclude anyone without generational wealth. Our events programming is traditional. Our staff hiring practices could be more inclusive." In other words, everything that makes your clubs exclusive in the traditional sense. He nodded uncomfortably. Market forces are pushing us toward change whether we like it or not. We can either lead that transition or be left behind by it. I appreciated his honesty, even if his motivations were primarily financial. Change driven by market pressure was still change, and it could benefit communities that had been excluded from these spaces for generations. I'll consider your offer, I said, but I'd want to review your current operations first, meet with your management teams, understand the resistance you're likely to face. Of course, I'll have my assistant arrange site visits to our flagship properties. We exchanged business cards, his embossed with gold lettering on heavy cardstock, mine simple and modern. The contrast felt symbolic of the different worlds we represented and the potential for finding common ground between them. As the last guests departed and the staff began cleaning up, I walked through each of the club's main areas, noting the small changes that had accumulated over the months. Photos on the walls now included diverse faces alongside the traditional portraits of past presidents and major donors. The library had expanded its collection to include works by authors from various cultural backgrounds. The children's playroom featured toys and books that reflected the broader community. These weren't dramatic transformations, but they were visible signals that the clubs had evolved beyond their insular origins. New members who visited could see themselves reflected in the environment, while longtime members were gradually exposed to perspectives they might never have encountered otherwise. My phone rang as I reached my car. The caller ID showed my parents' number, and I smiled as I answered. "Mija, we just wanted to tell you how proud we were tonight." My mother's voice was warm with emotion. "Watching you speak, seeing how people responded to you, it was like seeing all our dreams come true at once." "You looked beautiful, Sophia," my father added, his accent still thick after all these years. "But more than that, you looked like yourself, strong and confident and kind." Their words brought tears to my eyes. For all the financial success and social recognition, their approval meant more than any award or acquisition. "I couldn't have done any of this without the foundation you gave me," I told them. "Everything I am comes from what you taught me about dignity and perseverance." "No, Mija," my mother said softly. "What you've built, that comes from you. We gave you roots, but you grew your own wings." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, my parents sharing details about the evening from their perspective, the people they'd met, the conversations that had moved them. My father was particularly excited about a discussion he'd had with a civil engineer who was working on sustainable water systems. My mother had spent time with several of the scholarship recipients, offering encouragement and sharing her own experiences as an immigrant pursuing education. After we hung up, I sat in the parking lot for a few more minutes, processing the evening and thinking about the future. The William Harrison opportunity represented a chance to scale the impact I'd been having, to influence policies and practices across a much larger network of exclusive institutions. But it also meant working within systems that were fundamentally resistant to change, trying to reform organizations that had been built on exclusion. The next morning brought a call from an unexpected source. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the president of the state university, wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss a potential partnership. "Miss Mendoza, your work with the scholarship program has caught our attention. We're developing a new initiative focused on supporting first-generation college students from immigrant families, and we'd love to explore ways to collaborate." The meeting was scheduled for the following week, but Dr. Martinez gave me a preview of their plans. They wanted to create a comprehensive support system that would help students not just access higher education, but succeed once they got there. Academic support, mentorship programs, internship opportunities, cultural competency training for faculty and staff. "We've learned that getting students enrolled is only the first step," she explained. "Many struggle with imposter syndrome, cultural adjustment, financial pressures that go beyond tuition costs. They need advocates who understand their experiences." It was exactly the kind of systemic approach that could create lasting change. Individual scholarships were valuable, but they didn't address the broader barriers that prevented talented students from reaching their potential. "I'd be very interested in supporting this initiative," I told her, "both financially and strategically."
Wonderful. I should mention, we're also hoping to expand our business school's curriculum to include more focus on social entrepreneurship and inclusive leadership. Your expertise in those areas would be invaluable. The idea of teaching had never occurred to me, but there was something appealing about the possibility of sharing practical knowledge with the next generation of business leaders. Too many MBA programs still taught success as a zero-sum game, where winning required others to lose. If I could help shift that mindset, even slightly, it might have ripple effects far beyond any individual deals I could make. That afternoon, I received a visit from Marcus Rivera at Oakmont Hills. He'd requested the meeting to discuss expansion plans for the dining program, but his expression suggested he had more on his mind than menu development. "Boss, I need to tell you something," he began, his usual confidence replaced by visible tension. "I've been getting offers. 3 different restaurant groups want to hire me away, and the money they're talking about is significant." I felt a familiar knot in my stomach. Marcus had become far more than an employee. He was a key part of the culture change we'd been building. His success in transforming the club's dining programs had made him a sought-after talent in the industry. "Tell me about the offers," I said, keeping my voice neutral. He outlined the proposals, each more lucrative than his current position. Executive chef roles at high-profile restaurants, opportunities to open his own places with investor backing, a television cooking show that would give him national exposure.
Any of those would be incredible opportunities, I acknowledged. What's holding you back? Marcus was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the golf course where a diverse group of members were enjoying their afternoon rounds. "What we're building here feels important," he said finally. "These places were symbols of exclusion for so long, and now they're becoming something different. When I see kids from my old neighborhood eating in dining rooms where they never would have been welcome before, when I hire cooks who look like my cousins and watch them develop skills they'll carry for life, it feels like more than just a job." I understood his dilemma. Career advancement versus social impact was a choice that many talented professionals from underrepresented backgrounds faced. The personal success that came with leaving could be significant, but it might mean abandoning the communities and causes that had shaped them. "What if we could find a way to give you both?" I asked. "Growth opportunities and continued impact?" His eyebrows raised with interest. "I've been approached about consulting with other club management companies. If that moves forward, we'd need someone to lead the culinary transformation across multiple properties. It would mean more responsibility, more visibility, and compensation that would rival what you're being offered elsewhere." "You'd want me to help other clubs change their dining programs?" "I'd want you to help other clubs change their entire approach to hospitality. Food is often the first way people experience a culture. If you can create menus that celebrate diversity while maintaining excellence, you're not just feeding people, you're changing how they think about what belongs in elite spaces." We spent the next hour outlining what such a role might look like. Marcus would maintain his position at our clubs while taking on consulting responsibilities for Pinnacle's properties and potentially others. He'd have the budget to hire and train a new generation of diverse culinary professionals, creating a pipeline of talent that could transform the industry. "There's one more thing," I added as our meeting concluded. "I've been asked to guest lecture at the university's business school. They want to include more diverse voices in their entrepreneurship program. Would you be interested in co-teaching a course on hospitality innovation?" Marcus grinned, his earlier uncertainty replaced by excitement. "Professor Rivera, I like the sound of that." 2 weeks later, I found myself in William Harrison's corporate office, a corner suite in a glass tower that offered panoramic views of the city's financial district. The space was decorated with the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted. Antique furniture, original artwork, Persian rugs that probably cost more than most people's cars. Harrison had arranged for me to meet his senior management team along with the board members who would need to approve any consulting arrangement. The conference room held 12 people, all of them white, all of them over 50, all of them regarding me with expressions that ranged from polite curiosity to barely concealed skepticism. "Gentlemen," Harrison began, "as I mentioned in my previous communications, Miss Mendoza has achieved remarkable results in modernizing country club operations while maintaining financial performance and member satisfaction.
I'd prepared extensively for this presentation, knowing that I'd need to speak their language while challenging their assumptions. The slides I developed focused heavily on data, membership trends, revenue analytics, demographic projections that showed the inevitable diversification of their target market. The exclusive hospitality industry is facing an inflection point, I began, clicking to a chart that showed declining membership across traditional country clubs. Younger, affluent demographics have different values and expectations than previous generations. They're looking for experiences that align with their social consciousness, not just their economic status. A man in his 60s raised his hand. "Miss Mendoza, our clubs have waiting lists. We don't need to chase after people who don't appreciate our traditions."
With respect, Mr. Patterson, I replied, having done my research on each board member, your waiting lists are shrinking and aging. The average age of new members across your properties has increased by 8 years over the past decade. That's not sustainable long-term growth. I clicked to the next slide, showing projections of what would happen if current trends continued. Empty dining rooms, unused tennis courts, golf courses that couldn't cover their maintenance costs. The choice isn't between tradition and innovation, I continued. It's between evolution and obsolescence. For the next hour, I walked them through case studies from our 3 clubs, how we'd increased family memberships by 40% by creating more inclusive children's programming, how our diverse dining options had led to a 25% increase in event bookings, how our scholarship program had generated positive media coverage that enhanced the club's reputations among younger professionals. "But surely there must be some friction with existing members?" asked another board member. "People join exclusive clubs precisely because they're exclusive." "There's a difference between exclusive and exclusionary," I explained. "Our clubs maintain high standards for facilities, service, and member conduct, but those standards aren't based on ethnicity, accent, or family background. They're based on respect for the community and appreciation for excellence." The questions continued for another 30 minutes, some genuinely curious, others clearly designed to find flaws in my approach. But I could see that the financial data was having an impact. These were business people first, and business people understood that demographics didn't lie. Harrison concluded the meeting by asking me to prepare a detailed proposal for transforming their membership and programming policies. "We'll need specific timelines, budget requirements, and risk mitigation strategies," he said. "This would be a significant undertaking." As I gathered my materials, one of the younger board members approached me privately. "Ms. Mendoza, I want you to know that not everyone in this room is resistant to change. Some of us have been arguing for modernization for years. Your success gives us the ammunition we need to overcome the old guard." His name was David Chen, and he represented the 3rd generation of his family's investment firm. "My grandfather faced discrimination when he first tried to join these clubs in the 1980s, he told me. He eventually gained acceptance, but only after proving himself financially in ways that were never required of white applicants. I'd like to make sure my daughter doesn't have to navigate those same barriers." It was a reminder that even within elite circles, there were people who understood exclusion firsthand and were ready to support change when given the opportunity. The drive back to my office gave me time to process the morning's conversations. The Pinnacle opportunity was larger and more complex than I'd initially realized. Transforming 12 clubs across 3 states would require a coordinated effort involving hundreds of staff members and thousands of current members. The resistance would be significant, the timeline measured in years rather than months. But the potential impact was equally significant. These weren't just businesses. They were institutions that shaped social norms and cultural expectations. If we could demonstrate that elite spaces could be both exclusive and inclusive, it might influence other industries and organizations to reconsider their own practices. My assistant knocked on my door as I was reviewing financial projections. "Ms. Mendoza, Dr. Martinez from the university is here for your 2 o'clock meeting." Dr. Martinez arrived with a folder full of research and a level of enthusiasm that reminded me why I'd been drawn to academic partnerships. She'd spent the past 2 weeks developing a comprehensive proposal for the first-generation immigrant student support program. "We're calling it the Bridge Initiative," she explained, spreading documents across my conference table. "Academic bridges to help students transition from high school to college-level work.
cultural bridges to help them navigate unfamiliar social environments, professional bridges to connect them with career opportunities. The scope was impressive. Mentorship programs pairing students with successful professionals from similar backgrounds, summer transition programs to help incoming freshmen develop study skills and campus navigation strategies, internship partnerships with companies committed to diversity hiring. We've identified 47 students for the TILET program, she continued, all first-generation college students from immigrant families, all with strong academic potential but significant risk factors for dropping out. I reviewed the budget requirements, the staffing plans, the metrics they'd use to measure success. It was exactly the kind of systematic approach that could create sustainable change rather than just individual success stories. I'm ready to fund the full pilot program, I told her, but I'd also like to propose an addition. Dr. Martinez looked up expectantly. Business mentorship. Pair these students with successful entrepreneurs who can provide practical guidance about turning education into economic opportunity. Help them understand that their backgrounds are assets, not obstacles. That would be incredible. Do you have mentors in mind? I thought about the network I'd built over the years, the diverse group of business leaders who'd struggled with similar challenges and succeeded despite them. I can provide a dozen committed mentors immediately, with more as the program grows. We spent another hour refining the proposal, discussing implementation timelines and success metrics. By the end of our meeting, we'd outlined a program that could serve as a model for universities across the country. There's one more thing, Dr. Martinez said as we concluded. The business school dean would like to discuss creating an endowed chair in inclusive entrepreneurship, a faculty position focused on teaching business ethics and social responsibility. Would you be interested in funding such a position? An endowed chair would be a permanent legacy, ensuring that future generations of business students would be exposed to different perspectives on success and leadership. It was the kind of investment that could influence thousands of careers over decades. Send me the proposal, I said. I'm very interested. That evening, I attended a board meeting at Riverside Golf and Tennis Club. These monthly sessions had become opportunities to review operational performance and plan future improvements, but they also served as bellwethers for member sentiment. The financial reports were consistently positive. Membership retention was at an all-time high, with very few departures despite the cultural changes we'd implemented. New member applications had increased significantly, with waiting lists developing for the first time in years. The demographic profile of our new members is quite different from historical patterns, reported Susan Walsh, our membership director. We're seeing more young families, more professionals from tech and healthcare industries, more diversity in ethnic and cultural backgrounds. Any complaints from existing members? Asked board member Thomas Crawford, a longtime member who'd been skeptical of our changes initially. Very few, Susan replied. Most members seem to appreciate the enhanced programming and improved facilities. The few complaints we've received have been about noise levels during children's events, not about the diversity of participants. It was a significant shift from the early months after my acquisition, when we'd fielded numerous calls from members threatening to leave over our new inclusion policies. Apparently, most people adapt to change more easily than they expected, especially when that change came with tangible improvements to their experience. What about staff feedback? I asked. Our operations manager, Janet Kim, consulted her notes. Employee satisfaction surveys show marked improvement across all categories. Staff report feeling more respected by members, more supported by management, and more optimistic about advancement opportunities. The staff changes had been subtle but significant. We'd promoted several long-term employees who'd been overlooked under previous management, implemented diversity training for all customer-facing roles, and established clear protocols for addressing discriminatory behavior. I have to admit, Thomas said, I was worried about these changes initially, but my granddaughter started playing tennis here over the summer, and she's made friends with children from backgrounds very different from ours. It's been good for her to see that excellence comes in many forms. After the board meeting, I walked through the club's main areas, noting the small signs of cultural evolution that had accumulated over the months. The trophy cases now included awards for community service alongside golf championships. The member bulletin board featured announcements for ESL classes and cultural celebration events.
The children's area displayed artwork created by kids from the local elementary school, part of an after-school program we'd started hosting. These weren't dramatic transformations, but they represented a fundamental shift in the club's identity. From a fortress of privilege to a gathering place for excellence, from exclusion to inclusion, from tradition as stagnation to tradition as foundation for growth. My phone buzzed with a text from Carmen Silva, the scholarship recipient I'd met at the fundraiser. She was halfway through her first semester at the university, and her messages had become a regular source of joy and inspiration. "Miss Mendoza, just wanted to share some good news. I got selected for the business school's Entrepreneurship Accelerator program. My idea is to create a platform connecting immigrant-owned small businesses with customers who want to support diverse entrepreneurs. Thank you for showing me that business can be a force for positive change." Reading her message, I felt the same pride I'd seen in my parents' faces at the fundraiser. This was what success looked like when it expanded beyond individual achievement to community impact. Carmen and students like her would go on to create businesses, hire employees, support causes, and mentor the next generation. The ripple effects would continue long after I was gone. As I prepared to leave the club, I found myself back in the foyer where my journey had begun. The marble floors still gleamed under the crystal chandelier, but the space felt completely different now. Instead of echoing with cruel laughter, it welcomed conversations in multiple languages, people from different backgrounds finding common ground in their pursuit of excellence. 9 months ago, I'd stood in this exact spot, feeling isolated and diminished by people who viewed my accent as entertainment. Tonight, I stood here as the owner of 3 thriving clubs, a respected voice in the community, and a catalyst for change that extended far beyond these walls. But more than that, I stood here as myself, Sophia Mendoza, daughter of Colombian immigrants, Harvard MBA, successful entrepreneur, and proud owner of an accent that told the story of a family's courage and a young woman's determination to succeed without sacrificing her identity. The mockery that had started in this foyer had led to acquisitions, transformations, scholarship programs, and opportunities for countless others to find their own paths to success. Sometimes the greatest victories came not from avoiding adversity, but from using it as fuel for positive change. As I walked to my car, I thought about the next day's schedule: a conference call with William Harrison about the Pinnacle Consulting proposal, a meeting with Marcus about expanding the culinary diversity program, a lunch with Dr. Martinez to finalize details of the endowed chair, and in the evening, dinner with my parents, where I'd share stories about the day's progress and listen to their wisdom about staying grounded amid success. The work was far from finished. There were more clubs to transform, more students to support, more barriers to break down. But tonight, I was content to drive home knowing that mockery had been transformed into opportunity, exclusion had become inclusion, and one woman's refusal to be diminished had created space for countless others to thrive. My accent would always be part of who I am, a reminder of where I came from and the journey that brought me here, but it would never again be used to make me feel small. Instead, it would continue to be the voice of change, speaking up for those who deserved better than the cruelty disguised as humor that had once filled these hallowed halls. The country clubs were just the beginning. The real transformation was in proving that excellence and inclusion weren't contradictory, that success could be measured not just in profit margins, but in the number of doors opened for others. And that sometimes the most powerful response to mockery was not to become someone else, but to become so successfully yourself that you change the rules of the game for everyone who follows.